Open source software. This video is going to look at the topic of open source software, what the term means, and how it forms with your ICT studies. So firstly, this video, the objectives we're going to cover are, we're going to define the term hardware and software. We're going to be able to identify examples of hardware and software. We're going to be able to define the term open source and explain the key features. And finally, you're going to be able to provide some examples of open source software for various different uses. Let's start with a question. So get yourself a pen and paper and write down the answer to this question. What is the difference between hardware and software? Pause the video while you do that, and then unpause it and we'll discuss the answer. So, hardware are the physical parts of a computer. So see if you can now think about any physical parts. Just jot them down on your piece of paper. Pause the video while you do that, and then unpause it and we'll look at some answers. So you've got, for example, your hard drive, as you can see there. You've got your graphics card. Got your motherboard, and you've got your case. There are loads of other physical components like your CPU, your memory, your RAM, for example, that all are parts of the hardware of the computer that you might have written in your list, which is fine, but hardware are the physical parts of the computer. So what is software? Well, software are programs that enable a computer to perform a specific task. These are the programs that run on the hardware that you've installed on the computer. So your operating system, like Windows, for example, or iOS, that all is a piece of software that operates on a computer. Now, you could write down on your paper some different examples of software that you might have. Pause the video while I do that, and then unpause it while I'll show you some examples. So I'm hoping that the most obvious example you've gone for is the Microsoft Office suite of software. So Microsoft Word, Microsoft Excel, PowerPoint, and Outlook, for example, or Access. They're all examples of software. You may have others, which is great and fantastic because that means you understand different types of software. Now, within our bracket of software, we have two different options. You have commercial software and you have open source software. And commercial software tends to be software which is paid for. So you have to pay to purchase it, where open source software tends to be free. The other main difference between commercial and open source software is that open source software is what it says. It's open to anybody to use and to edit and tweak. You can see the code. Where in commercial software, it's actually locked down. So in other words, Microsoft Word protect their code. You can't use it because that'd be a breach of copyright. Now, there is the best example of commercial software. Microsoft Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and Outlook. Believe it or not, though, they all cost money. They actually can be bought for a subscription online, or you can buy them outright, but you can buy open source software, which is totally free, which is like the Libra Office, which I'll look at in more detail later in this video, which provide very similar packages, but are totally free. And that's because open source is distributed freely, but it can be edited by anybody freely. So open source software, you might be thinking, sounds really good, it's free. Well, yeah, that's the main benefit. It is totally free. It's free to use, no licensing, nothing. You can just put it on your computer and use it. Also, it uses what's called open standards. In other words, all the files that it saves in are accessible by other programs. So in other words, it doesn't matter whether you save it on a Windows computer, it should work on a Mac computer, and it should work on a Linux computer, for example. And it uses what's the agreed standard. Sometimes commercial software has file types which are specific to their software. Nothing else can open it. It's compatible. So like I mentioned there, it works theoretically on all different platforms. You'll get an open source version of Libra Office for your Mac, for your PC, or for your Linux, for example, machine. It can work cross-platform, so you can work across all those different platforms I just talked about. It's more secure. Now that is debatable in some world, because some people say that because anybody can edit the code, they can change it, but the belief here is that the people that actually work on the open source software and develop this free software package are expert coders who've got a real interest in coding and giving something back to free and enjoy coding, and because of that they keep updating it all the time. They close any loopholes in the platform quicker than what the commercial companies do. And that's quite a big one for many people. It's independent. It's totally independent. It's totally done by a community of people who basically work freely in their own time, volunteering to maintain these pieces of open source software. If you've got an interest in software, you could get involved in open source and be able to do something similar like this. So here is an example of some open source code. I have gone into Mozilla Firefox and I've had a look at some of their bug fixes, and you can see there somebody has fixed a bug and they've shared the code. That code is openly available. If you go to Google, you can do a little search, you can get access to the code. That to me means very little because it's only one section of code, but it does mean it's freely available. That would not be available on a commercial piece of software. So here is your first main task. You can see the table here which you've got, and you've got commercial software and you've got open source software. And I've got different types, so word processing, presentation, spreadsheets, internet browser and graphic design. I want you to use your internet to go and try and find me examples of commercial packages which do all of those 5 things. And I want you to find me open source options which can do those 5 things, the names of the packages that can do it. Pause the video while you do that, and then unpause it and we'll have a look at some answers. So, word processing, the commercial, I would assume most of you go down the Microsoft option. Microsoft Word, for example, is word processing. Microsoft PowerPoint is the presentation software. Microsoft Excel is the spreadsheet software. Internet browser, you could add Microsoft Edge, for example, or you could have gone Chrome. Chrome, believe it or not, belongs to Google, and that makes it commercial. It is distributed what's called freeware, so it's given away freely, but it does technically belong to Google Chrome. It's not actually what we define as open source software. Graphic design, you probably go for something like Photoshop. There may be other ones, so Adobe actually own Photoshop. Now on the alternative side, the open source one, you could have Libra Writer, which is word processing, or Open Office, for example, as another one. But Libra Writer is an open source. Libra Impress, for example, is their PowerPoint version. Open Office, again, have got a version of it. Libra Calc is a spreadsheet version of Microsoft Excel, which is free. Or again, Open Office calculator works there. Internet browser, Mozilla Firefox. That would be probably one of the more obvious ones you might have seen, which is open source. And graphic design, GIMP. There is actually a program out there, you probably find it, GIMP, which obviously is a free open source graphic design program which you could use. You may have other answers, which is fine, but remember the difference there between commercial and open source is one, is going to A, cost you money to buy the commercial software, and B, the code isn't going to be freely available for you to edit and adapt. So let's go into more detail about LibreOffice, because you could technically download this today to your computer and it's totally free. So you won't need to pay a subscription to Microsoft, for example, for Office, or you won't need to buy it. So if you go to the website LibreOffice, or you go to Google and search for it, you'll see this web page here. If you were to click on the download option that you've got, right, you will see that it takes you to a web page here where you can download the latest version, and it should find the latest version for your computer. So you can actually download this, and it'll download fairly straightforward. It is quite a big package. I think it's about, I want to say 800 megabytes, we'll soon see. And that's what LibreOffice Writer looks like. Now, you probably think it looks just like Word. Well, that's because it is. It's word processing. Now, the one thing you might notice, though, that is maybe slightly annoys you, because it doesn't look the same, is that you want the ribbon. Across the top where you see the file there, edit and view, you want the ribbon. Well, actually, you can have the ribbon. You just need to change the setting. So you need to go into the View option, go to User Interface, and go to Toolbars, and you need to make sure you choose the Tabbed option. So you can see there I've selected the Tab one. So I've gone from the Standard Toolbar, which is what I've got there, to Tab one. And lo and behold, look at that now. I now have my tabs like you'd probably find on the commercial software like Microsoft Word. And you could use that package just like you would use any other. If you're interested and you've got access rights on your computer, maybe you want to download LibreOffice and give it a go. You probably will then find that you'll ask yourself, why am I paying for Microsoft Office when I can use a free alternative which works with Microsoft file formats? It will open all the files that you do in Microsoft Office, but it actually is totally free and it's totally open source, and it will update itself for you. So there's one final task for you now. I want you to go and research for me and find examples of open source software that can undertake the following tasks. So in other words, I would like to find me software which can do Office applications, internet browsing, graphic design, financial accounting, sound editing, and video editing. So I'd like you to go and try and find me open source software packages which can do all of those. Write them down on your pen and paper in a nice long list, and see what you can find. And maybe, if you've got access rights to your computer, you might want to try and actually use some of these if they're going to meet any needs that you've got. For example, some of you might be particularly interested in the video editing or the sound editing software which exists. Some very good open source packages which exist in the market. So, we've now reached the end of this session where we've been looking at open source software, and hopefully you now feel confident enough to say that you can define the key terms of hardware and software. You can identify examples of hardware and software. You can define the term open source and explain the key benefits. And you can provide examples of open source software for the various different uses. If you can do all that, then you fully understand what we wanted to cover today when talking about open source software. Don't forget that you can get hold of any open source software freely via the internet, but make sure that you have the rights to be able to install that on your computer and you have permission from the person whose computer it is before you download and install any software. Hopefully, you now feel more confident in this topic that we just covered today.